Dear Mrs. Sprague, I'm sorry I didn't write to you sooner. In Manzanar, it is very nice, except a little hot and dusty. I was sick for one day, after we had our typhoid shot. On Tuesday, we are going to have our second one. I bet you were very busy Friday. I bet the boys and girls were all happy, because it will be summer vacation. Out here, we have no school. All we do is eat, play, and sleep. My mother said I'm getting too lazy. On the way to Manzanar, we passed through Turlock. I saw Puthi and Ayoko. Lots of Japanese people were waiting for the train. Dorothy Sakuri said you were going to visit Turlock. I wish you can come to Manzanar so I can meet you, but Manzanar is a little too far because it took us 16 hours to reach here. Well, it's late now, right when you have time. Yours still, Amiko Hayashi. Written by Amiko Hayashi to her teacher in 1942, this was one of many letters sent from inside Manzanar and 9 other Japanese internment camps during the period of internment. But let's back up a bit. How did Amiko and some 120,000 other Japanese Americans find themselves forced from their homes and into these camps? How were citizens' rights so openly violated, and how do people stand up to these decisions to see them overturned? This is Japanese Internment, a deep dive by Jackson Pearson and Cal Kimball. Beginning in the year 1868, mass migration to the United States from Japan began because of the Meiji Restoration, where the Japanese militaristic government was overthrown in favor of an emperor-led government. This led to immigration reforms in Japan, which led to roughly 200,000 Japanese citizens immigrating to the United States. Many immigrated to Hawaii, with some even arriving before it was a part of the U.S. In the early part of this mass migration, the people typically immigrating were men looking for labor jobs to help establish themselves within the country. This included jobs such as farming and other hard labors, often low-paying jobs. In the later half of this immigration wave, many women immigrated from Japan to marry already established men. These women and men had often never met, and they had only rather seen pictures of each other. These Japanese immigrants were often met with severe racism in the towns and cities where they settled because of fears that they would create competition for already settled citizens in the workplace. This racism within towns and cities led to the creation of many Japanese American neighborhoods and communities within them, with many turning into vibrant and thriving communities. The fears of competition between Japanese immigrants and already settled residents became so bad that in the 1920s, lawmakers instituted the Immigration Act of 1924, which completely banned the immigration to the United States from Asian countries and limited it from others. This was one of the first overt acts of racism from the United States towards Japanese immigrants and already established Japanese American citizens. Also during this time, future President Franklin D. Roosevelt was a columnist for the Macon Telegraphy. During his time there, he wrote one of his columns, "The argument works both ways. I know a great many cultivated, highly educated, and delightful Japanese. They have all told me that they would feel the same repugnance and objection to having thousands of Americans settle in Japan and intermarry with the Japanese as I would feel in having large numbers of Japanese come over here and intermarry with the American population." This quote from Roosevelt may help us to understand his feelings towards Japanese immigrants to the United States and how he felt about them mixing with already settled white Americans, and it could also help us to understand why he did some of the things which he does in the future in relation to Japanese Americans. Now, if we jump slightly forward in time, we come to the later 1930s, prior to the United States' involvement in World War II. During this time, previously mentioned Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected as the President of the United States. As wartime tension grew with both Germany and Japan, Roosevelt ordered surveillance to begin on Japanese Americans to identify potential individuals who could potentially be unloyal to the country should war break out. These surveillance reports, of which there were multiple, overwhelmingly found that the Japanese Americans were loyal to the country and would be should war break out. These findings were then provided to Roosevelt and his staff.
The Japs copied their German masters in striking hard at airfields. Hickam Field, northwest of Honolulu, and the Ford Island Naval Plane Base were the first objectives of Japan's treachery.
On December 7, 1941, Imperial Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. This attack was the turning point for Japanese Americans and their treatment within the country during the war. After the attack, General John DeWitt provided Franklin Roosevelt with a report with reported acts of Japanese espionage within the United States. This report led to congressional hearings where many people within the government voiced their opinions for the removal of Japanese Americans. It was believed by many in the government and the country that Japanese Americans posed national security threats because of their ethnicity. However, the acts of sabotage, which were the very basis of General DeWitt's report, which sparked this belief towards Japanese Americans, were later found to have not been sabotaged by Japanese Americans, and in some cases were even the work of animals such as cows. Despite this report, which contained untrue information, and the previous reports stating that Japanese Americans were likely not a threat to national security, internment seemed inevitable, with 93% of Americans in favor of internment of Japanese immigrants and 59% in favor of internment of Japanese American citizens in March of 1942.
On February 19, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed into order Executive Order 9066, which was aimed at reducing spying by Japan in America. How this was done was by creating military zones on the West Coast, and anyone who was 1/16th Japanese or more was to be removed from these areas. At first, people were given a choice to leave, with over 15,000 Japanese Americans choosing to do so. However, when these people left their homes to move east, they were met with fierce racism, and many non-Japanese Americans already settled in these areas called for them to be put into camps. This was because they now feared that the new influx of Japanese Americans would bring violence to these areas. This was when internment camps began. Once the internment began, anyone ordered to a camp was given 6 days of notice prior to them being forced to the camps. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry and were told to leave everything else behind. Before the Japanese Americans could be moved to internment, or relocation centers as they were called by the government, they had to stay in what were called assembly centers. Assembly centers were often not made to house humans, often being old fairgrounds or racetracks, and many people had to sleep in animal stalls which had been converted into living spaces. There was work available in these centers to the Japanese Americans, but regardless of experience, they could not be paid more than that of an army private. People were also allowed to leave the camps under special circumstances to work in agriculture or for college. After spending up to several months in the assembly centers, the Japanese Americans held there would be moved to more permanent internment camps. These camps were managed by the War Relocation Authority, or the WRA. In these camps, families were given rooms normally about 20 by 25 feet in length, and unmarried men and women were housed in communal dorms. Everyone living within the camps were forced to use communal bathrooms and eating spaces. Similar to the assembly centers, there was work available within the camps for the people living within them. However, the pay ranged from $12 to $19 a month, which was comparatively low to wages outside the camps. There were also incidents of violence within the camps, with several fatal incidents involving citizens interned inside the camps and the soldiers guarding them. But despite all the racism and government actions they faced, there were still many people who fought for the freedom of Japanese Americans from these camps. One of these people was Gordon Hirabayashi. Hirabayashi was a Japanese American citizen who was morally opposed to Japanese internment. He refused the nightly curfews imposed on Japanese Americans and was arrested for not following them. He wanted to take the very concept of internment all the way to the Supreme Court. However, the case that the Supreme Court ruled on was him disobeying his curfew, which was unanimously upheld. This case, however, gained national attention and showed the country that people were willing to fight for their rights to be free and a part of the country which they were citizens of. Another group fighting to show the country that Japanese Americans were loyal to the United States was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was a group made up of Japanese Americans who had volunteered for the military and were sent to Europe to fight in World War II. They fought ferociously and courageously throughout Europe, and during the war, the unit garnered thousands of military honors, including over 4,000 Bronze Stars, 21 Medals of Honor, and the entire unit was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for heroic behavior. This unit helped to show the American people that almost all Japanese Americans were not only loyal to the country, but they were also willing to fight to keep it a free nation and ensure the rights and freedoms of all citizens regardless of their race. Following the end of the war, all 10 Japanese internment camps were closed and all the citizens inside were freed. However, many went back to find what had previously been their lives in shambles. Many had had property stolen or seized by the government, or their businesses had failed, and what had once been a thriving community was forced to rebuild. It wasn't until 1988 when the government officially apologized for the internment, and each surviving victim was awarded reparations in the amount of $20,000. So to end, racial discrimination existed in the United States post-Great Depression and in World War II. Due to the bombing at Pearl Harbor, Americans of Japanese descent lost their individual freedoms and were forced into internment camps for the duration of the war. It wasn't until courageous people across the country stood up to these injustices and caused the government to question its actions and return these citizens their rights and their freedoms. Thank you for watching.